Throughout human history, we've seen countless highly questionable personalities rise to the very extremes of power. Adolf Hitler may have been just sane enough to convince millions that he was the right man for the job, but the man came with a treasure chest of the absurd. Charles IV of France went from Charles the Beloved to Charles the Mad during his reign and reportedly thought that he was actually made of glass, while the mental stability of George III of England collapsed to such a point that he became unable to rule for the final decade of his regency. But then we come to a man born Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known then as now as Caligula, a man who had a traumatic upbringing before becoming emperor and whose initial period of power was seen as a huge success. But after a serious illness that saw him remain unconscious for a month, the Caligula who returned was very, very different. The final years of his reign are remembered as a blizzard of some of the strangest, most depraved, and outright cruel actions you're ever likely to hear in connection with the sitting ruler. Incest, sadism, paranoia, theft, murder, and of course a good old-fashioned god complex. The story of Caligula really does have it all. Before we dive straight into the madness of Caligula, it's important to begin with a slight disclaimer. There's probably no other leader throughout history that comes with such a litany of truly bizarre stories attached to him as Caligula does. A quick search on Google is going to lead you into a dizzying torrent of utter madness and depravity that was said to be Caligula's life. But it is important to remember that this was a man who died nearly 2,000 years ago, and almost all of what we know about him in the modern age came from the ancients, many of whom were just as likely to embellish stories and exaggerate events as we see today. Maybe they are all true. Perhaps he really was one of the most mentally unhinged people we've ever seen take power. But then again, after his death, there was said to be a concerted effort to destroy his reputation and to almost expunge him from the glorious annals of the Roman Empire. Many stories regarding him may simply be gossiping hearsay with a Chinese whisper twist that created some of the more unbelievable tales. We just don't know. The truth is, though, that his reign caused significant problems within the Roman Empire, and many were not only glad to see the back of him, but were eager to ridicule and destroy his memory. It's now commonly understood that a child's formative years have a huge bearing on how they grow up, and if that's the case, it's perhaps not a great surprise that Caligula's sanity eventually unraveled. However, things began well for the young boy born into a well-to-do Roman family, part of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which formed Rome's first 5 emperors. His father, Germanicus, was a well-respected Roman general, and his mother, Agrippina the Elder, whose father had been a close friend of Emperor Augustus, carried an almost regal air and was highly regarded by her peers. The two had 6 children who survived into adulthood. 3 sons, Caligula, Nero, and Drusus, and 3 daughters, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Drusilla, and Julia Livilla. As a family, they would often accompany their father on his military campaigns, and after successful operations in Germania, Germanicus was sent to govern the eastern provinces while his family remained in Rome. Now, before we arrive at our first tale of intrigue and possibly murder, it's important to set the scene here. The Roman Empire reached dizzying heights during its heyday, but political backstabbing, ravenous personal ambition, and vicious bloodshed were just as much as part of the Roman story as their famed architecture, road systems, and sanitation network. Rome regularly seemed just a step or two away from upheaval, and those who had obtained power were constantly wary over who might be waiting rather greedily in the wings. At this point, Emperor Tiberius was at the helm, Rome's second emperor after Augustus and Germanicus, who was a nephew of the much-loved Augustus, was widely seen as the next in line to the throne. Tiberius may not have been a terrible emperor, but he was certainly no Augustus. His time as the most powerful person in Rome was solid but unspectacular, and he was said to remain deeply paranoid about the Senate and how it might be colluding against him. Germanicus, on the other hand, was supremely popular throughout Rome and was compared to Julius Caesar and even Alexander the Great in terms of their age and semi-mythical military campaigns. However, popularity was a dangerous chalice in ancient Rome, and when Germanicus fell ill and died mysteriously in what is today Syria in 19 AD, questions were immediately asked as to whether the governor of Syria, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, or even the emperor himself, may have been behind his death. The loss of his father at the age of 7 had a traumatic effect on the young Caligula. Initially, he lived with his mother, and for a time it appeared as if his 2 older brothers had been elevated as Tiberius's heirs. However, the wheels of political intrigue moved quickly in ancient Rome, and over time the family's standing began to slip, thanks in no small part to Lucius Aelius Sejanus, a politician and close confidant of Tiberius, who in part led the purge against Caligula's family through the infamous treason trials. His mother and Nero were banished from Rome in 29 AD on charges of treason, which also carried salacious accusations of sexual misconduct and corruption. Nero died shortly after his banishment, possibly by his own hand, but then again maybe not. This was all a really long time ago, and his mother died in 33 AD on the island of Pandateria, ironically, where her mother had once been exiled. Caligula's remaining brother, Drusus, was also imprisoned and died that same year, and his 3 sisters were sent into exile. In just a few years, the family had been decimated, and many assumed that the young Caligula was going to be next. But instead of having him killed or dropping him into a dungeon never to reappear, Tiberius exiled the young boy to the island of Capri, where he remained for 6 years. And to add a little extra spice to this already sordid tale, Emperor Tiberius had also decided to up and leave Rome for, well, you guessed it, Capri. This left us with a situation where the young Caligula is forced to spend years in close proximity to the man responsible for the destruction of his entire family. As I said earlier, a difficult upbringing, and one which in today's age would probably take several decades of therapy to sort out. As the purges against his family expanded with murderous effect, few would have dared believe that Caligula would not only make it to adulthood, but will one day become emperor. His time on Capri may have ostensibly been as a prisoner, but over time his relationship with Tiberius improved to such an extent that he was made co-heir along with his cousin Tiberius Gemellus, who was also Tiberius's grandson. When Tiberius died, aged 77 in 37 AD, again, we're not entirely sure if this was old age or whether a pillow to the face may have significantly sped up nature's course, the emperor, who had become increasingly unpopular in Rome, left a puzzling succession situation. According to his will, both Caligula and Tiberius Gemellus were joint heirs as well as jointly inheriting the emperor's estate. But things moved quickly, and it appears that there may have been some significant political support for Caligula, not least because of his links with Augustus and his lauded father, and on March the 18th, 37 AD, the young man who had once been the very epitome of a dead man walking was proclaimed emperor by the Senate. Caligula's time as emperor is often broken into 2, with the mystery illness that left him dangling between life and death for a month, the event that separates them. Broadly speaking, the first part of his rule, which lasted for around 6 months, was hugely successful, and through a series of reforms and what can only be described as politically motivated goodwill projects, he quickly captured the hearts of the Roman public. He handed out bonuses to soldiers, recalled many who had been exiled under Tiberius, and put on the kind of gladiatorial games that hadn't been seen in decades. Romans had grown tired of Tiberius, the absent emperor, and with this young man with a glittering patriarchal legacy now at the helm, a degree of optimism began sweeping the city and the wider empire. On the family front, the young emperor was reunited with his 3 sisters, who he hadn't seen for over 6 years, and for all intent and purposes, things were looking up for Rome's ruler after the chaos of his younger years. But This period of positivity came crashing down when the emperor was struck by a devastating and entirely mysterious illness. He remained unconscious for nearly a month, and few believed he would ever make a full recovery. There have been numerous theories over his illness, ranging from lead poisoning to epilepsy, and there have even been consistent suggestions that it was, in fact, an assassination attempt that didn't quite go far enough. The question of Caligula's mental health has puzzled historians for nearly 2,000 years. Some modern suggestions state that he may have suffered from hyperthyroidism and that seizures were a daily fear for the young emperor even before his major illness. Whatever it was, as the emperor lay frail and unconscious, discreet actions began to prepare Tiberius Gemellus for the throne, reportedly led by a praetorian prefect, Naevius Sutorius Macro, a man who Caligula had grown close to during the time on Capri, and who was said to have been instrumental in placing him on the throne instead of Tiberius Gemellus. As far as we can tell, few expected Caligula to recover, and had he died at that point, history would have remembered him very differently, no doubt as an excellent young ruler who was taken far too soon. But recover he did. When the emperor awoke with no immediate signs of long-term damage, most would have presumed that life was about to continue as normal and that Rome, and its popular young leader, was about to stride forward as only the Romans could. But what actually happened was really different. It didn't take long for Caligula's paranoia to set in. There had been some very tangible steps taken while he was ill to begin replacing him should he not recover, and when this came to light, his vengeance was swift. Tiberius Gemellus was effectively ordered to commit suicide, something the young man apparently needed help doing, while Caligula's father-in-law, Marcus Junius Silanus, and his brother-in-law, Marcus Lepidus, were executed, while his grandfather, Antonia Minor, who he shared with Tiberius Gemellus, also committed suicide during this period. Now, it's at this point of our story today where the facts, slander, and outright mythical tales relating to Emperor Caligula begin to merge into one almighty, repugnant beast. No doubt some of them are true, but it's also perfectly conceivable that many were embellished well after his death to accentuate his madness. Let us begin with incest. We believe that Caligula had sexual relations with Julia Drusilla, his favourite sister, which may have actually begun at a young age, and he may well have done the same with Livilla and Agrippina the Younger too. Some say that he did this as a way of securing an heir, and may well have even impregnated Julia Drusilla, who was married to another man at the time. When she died in 38 AD, Caligula's grief was all-encompassing, and he initially refused to allow her body to be taken away. When she was finally laid to rest, he requested that the Senate declare her a goddess as Diva Drusilla, in the same representation of the Roman goddess Venus or the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Now, the word incest comes from the Latin word incestum, which translates roughly as not pure, but was also used to cover a wide variety of sexual activities that were seen to step over the boundary of what was prim and proper. However, what was deemed unacceptable wasn't always clear. Roman and Greek mythologies littered with incest, and while brotherly and sisterly love was probably a step too far for the Romans, it wasn't uncommon for marriages between cousins or uncles and nieces to occur even at the highest level. Emperor Claudius, who came after Caligula, married his brother's daughter, Agrippina, after all, but generally speaking, incest was still considered a no-no, and accusations of such could ruin a reputation. When Julia Drusilla died, her surviving widower, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, was said to make advances on his two sisters-in-law, possibly as a way of shoring up his support as a possible heir. It appears as if, to begin with at least, Caligula looked upon Lepidus favourably as a possible heir, but in 39 AD, details of these supposed relationships with his two sisters, along with a rumoured plot against the emperor, emerged, tantalizingly known as the plot of 3 daggers. Lepidus was quickly executed, and Livia and Agrippina the Younger were both exiled to the Pontine Islands. Another questionable relationship that Caligula always said to have had was that with Incitatus, his horse. This has become one of the classic Mad Caligula tales, in which some say he attempted to make his steed, the consul of Rome, a political position as the head of the Senate that one would assume would require something of a logical human brain and perhaps even opposable thumbs. While this is a truly bizarre story, it may have some grounding and might not be as weird as you imagine. Caligula frequently sought to humiliate the senators, and perhaps the simple threat of placing a horse in charge of them emphasized his disdain. Whether or not he planned to actually dress Incitatus up in a robe and send him into the Senate, we'll never know, but the horse was said to have a stable of marble with an ivory manger, purple blankets, and a collar of precious stones. The final few years of his life seemed riddled with wacky exploits, as the state of the empire pitched up and down. In 39 AD, he pulled off a quite extraordinary stunt to build a floating bridge for over 2 miles across the Bay of Baiae, stretching from the resort of Baiae to the nearby port of Puteoli, over which he proudly rode his horse. The reason? Years before, Thrasyllus of Mendes, an astrologer and personal friend of Tiberius, had once predicted that Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. By actually riding his horse across this vast pontoon bridge, shattering the prophecy in a bizarre act of petulance, he was sticking a very public middle finger up at those who ever doubted him, specifically, of course, Thrasyllus of Mendes. He eventually took to referring himself as a god, namely Jupiter, and the title even began appearing on official documents. He built temples to himself and erected numerous statues in Rome, while apparently Caligula even had the idea of chopping off the head of the statue of Zeus at Olympia and replacing it with his own likeness. But while all of these stories may be wonderfully extravagant in their absurdities, let us not forget that Caligula was not a pleasant person. He was said to genuinely relish people squirming with discomfort and got quite a kick out of borderline, or, well, not so borderline torture. While attending gladiatorial games, he would remove the awning and prevent people from leaving so he could watch them slowly swelter in the Roman sun. If that didn't quite do it for him, he would sometimes order his guards to throw spectators into the pit and allow the wild animals to run amok. Further, by all accounts, the man was an absolute sexual deviant whose desires could stretch to any woman regardless of their standing or marital status. There are stories of the emperor inviting guests to lavish parties that, with our contemporary language, we would probably refer to as orgies, where he would have the women line up before he made a choice. And if that wasn't bad enough, he would then on occasion force the woman's husband to sit with him while he regaled them of his exploits with the man's wife. And while we're discussing his sexual misadventure, Caligula ordered the construction of 2 enormous floating palaces known as the Nemi ships, which were at the time among the largest boats in the world. While their use has long been argued over, the marble, mosaic floors, heating, plumbing, and even baths on board have led some to dub them floating orgy palaces. But during all of this brazen behavior, he did find time to get married and have a child, but even here, the story is far from clear. The first had been before his reign, but she died in childbirth, with reports of him not exactly being too broken up over it. The second and third were short-lived and ended with a divorce and a ruling from the emperor that they could never again be with another man. The fourth was Melonia Caesonia, a divorcee or widow, we aren't sure, who already had 3 children, was possibly already pregnant when she married Caligula in 40 AD after a short affair with the emperor. In terms of military campaigns, there were some potentially outlandish actions here too. He stretched the Roman Empire westward by annexing Mauritania, after he invited Rome's clan ruler Ptolemy of Mauritania to the city under friendly terms before promptly having him killed. But it was his exploits to conquer Britannia that were the strangest. At some point, probably around 40 AD, Caligula travelled to the cusp of his empire, where he stood on the shores of the English Channel. Now, what came next isn't at all clear. The more outlandish version states that Caligula had declared war on Neptune, the god of fresh water and the sea in Roman religion, and ordered his troops to begin attacking the water. The story does seem a little far-fetched even for Caligula, but the alternative tales are just as bizarre. Both tell of soldiers on the verge of mutiny over the poorly planned invasion of Britannica, with one stating that Caligula had them pick seashells as a punishment, or the other that he dressed some of his own men up as Britons and marched them through Rome as a way of preventing the humiliation of returning home empty-handed. Whatever happens, Caligula's planned invasion of Britannia ended in farce, and it showed many that he was not fit to lead. Through all the madness, whether entirely true or not, his relationship with the Senate and Roman nobility rapidly deteriorated. As his lavish lifestyle continued to spiral out of control, Rome's coffers were quickly emptied. In an act of shocking disregard for his fellow Romans, Caligula authorized the resumption of the treason trials, a practice under Tiberius that had seen his family purged for the simple reason that the fortunes of those found to be treasonous would be defaulted to the empire, and so onto him. This led to a period of absolute savagery where countless Romans were executed, certainly hundreds, maybe even thousands, and some even put the figure as high as 10,000. In 40 AD, he announced his intentions to up and leave Rome for the Egyptian city of Alexandria, where he hoped to be worshipped like a living god, and many influential Romans balked at such an idea. By this point, many had lost patience with the emperor, and there were open discussions over a potential assassination, with a plan to replace him with Claudius, the last male in the family bloodline and Caligula's uncle. On March the 24th, 41 AD, officers within the Praetorian Guard, led by Cassius Carrier, a man who had long been mocked relentlessly by Caligula, accosted him as he travelled through an underground passage to the amphitheatre. Carrier's knife was said to be first thrust into the emperor's body before he was set upon by the remaining guards, who stabbed him a total of 30 times. But not satisfied there, the assassins turned their attentions on Milonia Caesonia and 1-year-old Julia Drusilla, both of whom were quickly dispatched. The age of Caligula was over. While the planners of the assassination had hoped that by killing Caligula, they might be able to restore order and pride in the Roman Empire, with some suggestions that they may have hoped to restore the Republic, something that hadn't been seen since 31 BC, quite the opposite happened. There seemed to be genuine fury among the Roman people over what happened. Almost immediately, Caligula's uncle Claudius, who had likely been involved in the plot, also was made emperor, and he soon ordered the executions of those who had carried out the attack, including Carrier. Much what we know about Caligula comes from sources written well after his death, sometimes over a century later, and it's important to remember that writers of the age, like today, were more than open to embellishing stories and exaggerating events. Many of the stories of Caligula are so outlandish that we have to question their veracity. Was he really mad, or was this a case of mythical madness that may have been created to sully his name long after his death? Alas, we'll probably never fully know, but if he was the sexual disgrace, vicious psychopath, and human incarnation of a god as he believed, he must go down in history as one of the strangest and possibly craziest leaders we've ever seen. Mad or myth, the story of Caligula certainly never dull.